Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Pratum and PCmatic. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about one of the most rapid cybersecurity landscape changes that most of us have seen in our careers, and that's the sudden switch to the majority of office workers working from home. Before we get started, just really a single housekeeping note. We will be taking questions from attendees today, so please submit those using the chat feature that you'll have over on the right side of your screen, and we'll have Dave and Terry get the answers to those questions as we go. Now on to today's topic. This spring, most of us were expecting the work from home lifestyle to feel something like a sprint. And now obviously we've realized that it's really an ultramarathon with no known finish line. And it's a crowded race with about 66% of people who still have a job now working from home. And we're realizing that the triage policies we put together back in March really aren't built for the long term. The question is, where do we focus first in terms of making long-term strategies? In this conversation, our two cybersecurity experts will be providing concrete steps that you can take to create work-from-home policies built for the long haul. So let's go ahead and meet our two presenters for this afternoon. First is Dave Nelson. He's the founder and CEO of Pratum. He's a certified information system security professional with over 25 years of cybersecurity and technology experience. Dave is a fellow with the Information Systems Security Association, and he has led cybersecurity and technology organizations in both the public and private sectors. In 2008, Dave founded Pratum in Ankeny, Iowa, as one of the first pure-play information security companies in the Midwest. Today, Pratum is considered a leader in vCISO and security operations center services with clients across the nation. And I realized I forgot to give you my name at the beginning. My name is Trevor Mears. I work with Dave at Pratum, where I'm the Director of Partnerships and Content. Our second presenter is Terry McGraw. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Army and now serves as president of PCmatic Federal, a division of PCmatic Inc., providing endpoint cybersecurity to over 500,000 customers and over 2 million endpoints under management with PCmatic software solutions. The last 10 years of Terry's Army career were leading key cyber initiatives for the Army's Network Enterprise and Technology Command, Army Cyber Command, and the National Security Agency. Terry has led and operated some of the world's largest and most complex networks and served 6 years as Vice President of Global Cyber Threat Research and Analysis for Dell SecureWorks, providing managed cybersecurity services to over 4,000 commercial clients and leading its 6 counter-threat operations centers. Dave and Terry, thank you for joining us today to share your insights. And we'll get started with our first topic. I'll throw this question to Dave first. We hear a lot of general statements out there about how there are a lot of new cybersecurity threats because of dispersed workforce. What are some of the very specific issues that this new environment has put on the radar that we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. I think, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of today is just an uptick in social engineering attacks. Social engineering has been something that has been growing in popularity as we're getting better at securing our hardware, securing our software, building secure networks, building secure applications. It's getting harder to hack the technology. And so the attackers are pivoting and looking for a little bit easier way into the organization. And so the social engineering attacks have been on the rise. And with this whole shift from being in an office to being remote and being at home, a lot of our processes have changed. A lot of the informal kind of approvals and some of those types of things that we were seeing when we were in the office kind of went away. Now you can't just validate with your boss right across the street or right across the office, right across the hall, down the hall about a transaction that they want you to make, or validate with a team member about code that needs to be pushed. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of processes that weren't kind of solidified during this kind of work from home transition, and so the attackers know that, and they're capitalizing on the chaos and just really pushing forward in a lot of the spear phishing campaigns, general phishing campaigns, pre-texting, or kind of those fake phone calls pretending to be somebody that they're not. Seeing a huge uptick in that.
Terry, what specific threats are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think it actually the COVID and quarantine scenario has accelerated and exacerbated parts of the cyber threat landscape that have been there for a while, but have had a limited vector because we had mobile workforces before, but now everyone's sort of a mobile workforce. And the measures that we took to ensure the mobile workforce was secure now have to apply to your general population. And I don't think the architectures of our businesses were well equipped to do this at scale. The Internet of Things as it has already started to expand the cyber threat landscape and the attack surface that everyone's operating in. But within the confines of your business environment, you ostensibly had an architecture that you had more control over. You had policies and procedures in place. And Dave brings up an excellent point. I mean, one of the reason social engineering work and deep fake still works is that people lack two-party systems or two-party check systems. Business email compromise is still a huge problem because if I get something that looks legitimate and I'm responding to the CEO's email, et cetera, I don't validate that in fact came from the CEO. If I got a call from a CEO that sounds like his voice asking me to do something that's probably a little anomalous or a little bit suspect, I should have a two-party check system. And we've just, again, extended and exacerbated the landscape that we were dealing with before. But now we just have to the sprint is, as you said, is a marathon. We're going to have to start looking at how do we reconfigure our architecture to account for the extended attack surface that was limited before, but now is quite broad.
So you both talked a little bit about how some of these threats have been expanded from what they were in the past. What are some of the new threats that you've seen emerge that weren't as on our radar before we went to work from home?
You want me to take that, or you want to take that one, Dave? I would say that look, e-crime is accelerating for two reasons. Number one, it's about the fastest path to monetization. So the amount of money to be made in e-crime is unfortunately still growing exponentially, and our ability to thwart it seems to be going down. But related to that is there's a global underground economy that feeds this. The barrier to entry to being an e-criminal now is just a desire to commit crime. I can rent my infrastructure, I can rent my software, I can rent everything I need to be a criminal is all freely available, and I can lease that infrastructure to create attacks. So the prevalence of it and the low barrier to entry, I think, is what's accelerating what we're seeing. And unfortunately, social engineering still works, but the tools of the trade are now, 5-8 years ago, folks needed to know how to craft these tools. They need how to employ these tools. Now it's literally just a desire to commit crime, and I can go find the tools that I need to exercise that. So I think the rapidity of how quickly tradecraft becomes commoditized and then reused in the e-crime environment is one of the biggest upticks we've seen.
Yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily a lot of new attack vectors that have come, just from COVID or work from home. I think certain things are working more effectively, in certain environments, and like Terry was saying, you can rent all of the infrastructure you need. When you think about war, and Terry's got a military background, when you think of a physical war and the tools it takes to declare war and to carry out a war, the United States was well positioned because we had the infrastructure to build all of the equipment that we needed to sustain that. And now in this cyber environment, you've got a very small organization that maybe isn't even funded by a nation state that decides that they want to just rain terror in cyber world. And for a few bucks, they can lease a tremendous amount of resources from Amazon or Microsoft or Google or whoever they want, and they can target and they can overwhelm and they can do a lot of stuff in a very short period of time. It's becoming this constant catch-up game, right? We get one step ahead and we fall 2 steps behind. The attackers are always going to be there. Those guys, the criminals, are always going to be there. I've always said if they spent even a fraction of the amount of time that they did doing all of the nefarious things that they're doing, if they spent those energies on things that were good, man, we would have a ton of new technology, a ton of new things. It's amazing the amount of time and energy that they can devote to these things. From a company perspective or from an organization perspective, you've got to stop and you got to think about, am I positioned to be able to defend my organization against all threats, cyber threats across the world? We don't have to do that from a physical perspective. If I have a physical threat, I call the police department, or I call federal authorities, or I call the military, and they're going to deal with those physical threats from across the globe. From a cyber perspective, we don't have that, right? And so even Cyber Command is trying to figure out, how much of this is our responsibility, and rules of engagement are changing, and we as a society have to decide how much of this do we want the government to handle on our behalf, how much do we want to do on our own. Are we going to make offensive security by companies okay and legal? Are we still going to kind of say that's a bad thing? So you're trying to figure out how we deal with some of these threats that are just constantly evolving and changing, I think, is our biggest problem. It's not necessarily that there are new things, it's they're being maybe directed in new ways, or ways that we didn't, we got really good at protecting over here, and so we didn't worry about this because those attacks weren't coming as fast and furious. Now that we got really good over here, again, those guys are pivoting, and they're using these things that we weren't protecting against, or that we weren't spending a lot of time and money on. It forces us to refocus over here, and as soon as we get really good there, then they move to the next group over here.
What are some of the specific areas that you're alluding to there, Dave, that right now hackers seem to be going after because of the work from home environment? You both mentioned a little bit about disrupted business processes, so you can't shout over the cubicle wall to confirm something. Terry, you talked about the need for multi-factor authentication. What are some other areas that you see hackers exploiting because of the environment that we're in now?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is, our old security architecture, the old security model that we've used for decades now has been kind of what we call device-centric, right? So we focused on protecting the device, and if we could protect the device that was accessing our data, we could protect our data. Over the last several years, that's changed, and you may have heard things like zero trust architecture and some of these other things, but we've got to move to this environment where I don't care what device you're accessing my data from. I don't care what location you're accessing it from. I need to protect the data, because the data is what moves around either inside my environment or jumps outside of the environment into a supplier environment or a vendor environment or a client environment, and then it jumps right back in, right? So it's this whole cycle, and then this life cycle of this data moving all over. We've got to get much better at saying, I need to not focus on trying to secure a device, because like right now from this work from home, we sent people home and not everybody had a laptop. Sure, great. The people who normally worked from home or worked remotely or had that flexibility, they had a company-owned laptop, it was configured and secured and everything else. Everybody else, well, you went home and we immediately turned on VPN that we didn't have turned on before, and we let your home computer that everybody else in your house uses, it's all compromised, it's got viruses running all over it. We allowed that to connect back into the corporate network or into the corporate cloud. Now all of a sudden, we've got all of these unknown devices and these big, huge threats sitting out there that we just haven't managed. And we took that risk for a certain period of time, saying, hey, we can do this for the next 90 days. Everything should be done by June, and everybody would be good, and we'll be back to work. And now here we are, September, and we're still talking, well, maybe it'd be next June if we're lucky, right? So trying to really go back and reevaluate some of those risks that we took early on. How do we change our model from not worrying so much about the device-centric security, but moving to that data-centric security model? And it's not easy. It takes a lot of thought and planning, but that's where we're at right now, is kind of accelerating that process and saying, hey, we've got to start thinking about this today. Some organizations are really far ahead. They've been thinking about this for a long time. Others haven't even begun. And if you haven't begun, you're behind the 8 ball already.
Yeah, truly multi-factor authentication. I'm a big fan of zero trust architectures, but at its core is being as granular as you can in user object permission schemas, right? And validating that the data and the user is scoped to the exact access they need and is validated every time, and even data to data multi-factor authentication, right? I mean, and so I think Dave is spot on. What we did is we just expanded our attack surface, but the problem sets were there. Social engineering always existed. And I can't tell you how many times I've walked in an organization where they swear they had multi-factor authentication, but they didn't have it everywhere. Even complexity wasn't enforced, and logout. I mean, I briefed at Gartner and RSA year over year for about 5 years, and I would brief the incident response trends that we saw from our organization, and sadly, the percentage points barely moved from year over year. I mean, we're talking about the same fundamentals, and now we've just broadened the aperture for those fundamentals to fail at. And so I do think that this is primarily an architectural problem, but it's an architectural problem that is exacerbated again by the fact that we're not doing basic blocking and tackling. We don't have MFA involved. We don't have a good handle on our data, the data structures. We don't have full asset enumeration. All of the problems that we were able to sort of gloss over and contain because we had an office environment and a somewhat contained environment. Now you just, you've taken that and broadened the aperture again. So I think it's now time, if you haven't already, like Dave said, you really do need to start looking at methodologies by which people, you just assume that everything is dirty. You have to look at containerization, you have to look at MFA, and you have to look at segmentation, and even really look micro-segmentation. Architecturally is how we're going to address this, because unfortunately social engineering works a lot. Otherwise, people would be making billions of dollars in e-crime.
So that's a lot to absorb. If we hear that, like when we're talking about, we need to change our architecture, we need to be thinking about our permissions, those kinds of things. How do you recommend an organization start to tackle that? So if we walk away saying clearly we need to make some changes to adapt here, what are the best first steps to get going in that direction?
You want to go for it, Dick?
Go ahead.
No, so I like to start with a macro model, right? So there's lots of frameworks, whether it's NIST 800-53, there's, MITRE ATT&CK, that when they deal with pieces of the problem set, MITRE ATT&CK is based on your adversary view, 800-53 is very programmatic view of your environment building a maturity model. But if you raise it up one level and you looked at it and said, I need 3 major things to reduce my business risk in a cyber environment. I need to have sensing technologies that determine adversary and access to my environment, which most people have some level of. I need a view of myself. I need to understand what are the limits of my environment? How did that environment change? And have very, very good eyes on the things that are accessing my data. And then I need a really, really good handle on all of the things that are mission critical in my environment and those who I do business with. And that's not really hard to envision, right? How you get there can be a little bit more complex, but understanding fundamentally, I need a view of the adversary, a view of myself, and a view of the mission critical systems, and then decompose the piece parts of your environment already that comprise those 3 big pieces, and then start building out your programmatics for it. But I think it's important to understand where my gaps are fundamentally in those 3 big categories before you start overlaying very, very complex environment, because at the end of the day, you got to start somewhere. Eat the elephant one bite at a time, and start by understanding what you already know about your environment, what gaps exist in that environment, and what have you already invested in, and is it being used correctly? And then so it's a really good time to just take a step back and understand those 3 major piece parts of your organization and how it's changed because of the distributed workforce, and then begin from there. Dave, you may have a different take.
Yeah, no, I kind of piggyback off of that is really kind of reevaluating the risk of your organization, right? So if you had done a risk assessment before, things have changed. Your environment has changed. The way you're using data has changed. A lot of things have changed. So going back through and assessing the risk in the environment. When you think about information security, you've got to remember that there are 3 pillars. We talk a lot about the security, the confidentiality piece, the need to know, the locking people out of data so they can't see it, can't read it, those types of things. And that's certainly a critical piece, but there's also the integrity piece and the availability piece, right? We want to make sure not only that only the right people can see that data, but that the data can't be changed or manipulated without approval, right? And that the data is actually available when I need it. I joke a lot. I say I can make your data really secure and dig a big hole. I can dump your servers in it. I can pour concrete over it and plant some flowers on it. And baby, that data is secure. Nobody's getting access to it, including you, right? So I've really got I've got the confidentiality and I've got the integrity, but I've completely hosed the availability of that data. So you've got to ask yourself kind of four main questions, I think, when you kind of go through all of this. You say, what data do I have, right? And then assess your risk based on the confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of that data in kind of the whole life cycle. So what data do I have? Where does it come from? What do I do with it while I have it? So what happens within my organization, or does it go outside of the organization? And then what happens when I'm done with it? When I no longer ever want that data again? Does it need to be saved for a certain period of time? Does it need to be transferred someplace, destroyed, right? So you've got to look in each piece, in each part of the life cycle of that data, your risk changes because different people have access, different systems have access. It's either being monitored actively or it's not being monitored actively. So really assessing risk and doing that continual assessment is really critical of trying to identify, what's happening, what's going on, and how do we address security, especially when huge changes like this happen, when we send a boatload of people home and our entire architecture is kind of thrown out the window. Security policies, our training, our approval systems, all of those things are thrown out the window. One of the first things we've got to do is reassess that risk and say, are there any risks that, okay, yeah, we took them for the 30 days or the 60 days, the 90 days. Which ones are we still willing to continue with, and which ones do we need to start to mitigate today so that as this continues to drag on, we're prepared for it?
Yep. If you asked me to put a fine point, like if the one thing I would do today, if I hadn't already done so, honest, and I agree with everything you said. The landscape has changed, both we and how we fit into the cyber threat landscape. But multi-factor authentication, folks, if we were, look, I'm telling you, people say they're doing it, they're not. And true MFA everywhere. That would be like the first thing I would tackle. If you wanted step one to help lock down in my environment, assuming that everything is dirty, I need to make sure that everyone that's touching my environment is authenticated from the system that they're working on. And then I need to ensure that I understand what they've been doing in the environment when they're there. Like, what have they touched, and is that access limited? Those things would be like job one. Because you're going to have to lock down your environment to a higher degree than we've done historically.
Yep.
So one of the things we touched on earlier was the spike in people using personal devices. You mentioned that not everybody's got a company-issued computer at their home, so now they're on these private devices. Talk a little bit about what you have to do now to manage those things, because you hear of some companies sending out a memo to everybody that they need to make sure their home router is patched and things like that. How much realistically can we expect out of these end users to be doing these kinds of things? And if the answer is as obvious as I think it is, well, then what's the right next step to address that?
Yeah, I don't think it's realistic at all. I mean, think about even before we had work from home from COVID, we had work from home for any other reason. You had sick kids, you had vacation, you're on the road, you're a road warrior. And we had people working from coffee shops, from hotels, from convention centers. So to me, it's stopping and looking at this and saying, don't freak out about kind of some of the unknowns. Certainly those unknowns exist and they're going to continue to exist, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in that zero trust architecture of saying, I don't trust you. I don't trust the devices that you're coming from. Even if it's my own device that I manage, I could click, if I'm an authorized user, right, within the company. I've got my username and password, I've got multi-factor authentication, and I click on something and I open up a link, right? I was a trusted user on a trusted device using multi-factor authentication, but I screwed up and didn't follow policy. And I clicked on a link that I shouldn't have, right? So we have to assume, we have to take the approach that I assume that I've been breached, right? If I assume that I've been breached, now all of a sudden some of these other things I don't care about anymore. I don't care about the workstation. I don't care about the network that it's coming from. I care about the user and what they can actually do. So like what Terry was saying is, really restricting down the access of that user. Take ransomware today, right? So if I click on a phishing link and I get ransomware, I as an authenticated user, anything that I have access to is subject to being encrypted, right? So if I have the keys to the kingdom and okay, maybe I'm a trusted employee and you don't think I would do anything wrong, that's great. But what if what if I'm not the one actually controlling my account, right? I've got to look past well, I trust my employees. Yes, you trust your employees, but do you trust somebody that has your employee's account, right? You've got to take precautions against that and say, hey, if we restrict down what access Dave has to only what he absolutely needs to do his job, we can then restrict the depth to which that ransomware can get into our organization and start encrypting files, which reduces the scope, which reduces the cost, which reduces downtime for everybody else. There's just this cascading effect, right? So absolutely kind of going through that process and saying, let's start to identify who's got access to what do they need to actually do their job, and oh, by the way, make sure that when they transfer or they're promoted into a different job, revoke the access for the data that they don't need to do the new job anymore. That access creep and that just constant, conglomeration of data, the person in your company that has the most data access is the executive administrative assistant for your executive team, because executives don't do anything on their own. They've got somebody who does it all for them. And this person has been there for 20 years. That individual has gotten access to HR, they've gotten access to finance, they've gotten access to sales, they've gotten access to everything, and nobody's ever taken any of that away. So that is the person who's a huge target within the organization.
Yep, segmentation is huge. Even in traditional networks, limiting lateral scope is important, and all too often the Active Directory and even VLAN infrastructure is not well thought out in most large organizations. But I think micro segmentation has been growing for a while, but it's been cost prohibitive and very very intensive to implement. I think with now more cloud native environments, and I think with the need, being the mother of invention, I think we'll see more micro segmentation solutions hitting the market soon. And essentially, you are limiting the access to certain data at a transactional level. Like, I establish a connection, I access it, it's torn down, and that that limits your lateral movement capabilities quite a bit. So I think we'll see more of that as sort of as a countermeasure measure, sort of development. And I would not be surprised to see more solutions start to hit the market on that. But you don't need to have a micro segmentation solution to start segmenting your network. You absolutely can do that within the infrastructure you have, and you should validate that what you think about your infrastructure segmentation is true. And that may be as simple as having someone else do an external pen test. And validate that what you think about your environment it holds true to reality.
As companies are getting more involved with some of these personal devices and home networks, what are some of the legal concerns that we need to think about as network administrators and IT experts?
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier in our prep call. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to lay claim to the fact that I can provide legal advice here. But I will tell you that any time that you're going to extend a corporate view into a privately owned device, there is innumerable complications that are associated with that. And both the business and the person are open to liability on that access. So I think the best that we could hope as business leaders is that we can help train, coach, and even enable, like provide your home users software solutions that they may not otherwise have. Pay for their antivirus, pay for a VPN solution if you don't already have one implemented. Help them lock down their own environment with you providing, TTPs, good, training tips for home use, how to lock down their own environments. Ensure that everyone's using an authorized VPN to get in. Make sure that they have an antivirus solution that's implemented and updated. Make sure that the basic blocking and tackling is done. But when you try to extend your visibility down to that device, then that's when you open the morass of liability concerns. Who's accessing my camera? Do they access my file? It's as a business leader, I don't think I want to get in that environment. I think Dave's earlier point is the smarter way to go is just treat everything like it's dirty and lock down your internal data systems rather than try to play whack-a-mole at the end user, because I think it just opens yourself up for liability concerns that you won't be able to extricate yourself from. Dave, what?
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you, I'm not an attorney, so this isn't legal advice. just, Google anything with, BYOD problems, legal issues with BYOD agreements where a company's been sued because they wiped a phone when an employee left, or they took a laptop that they thought was had their data on it, and it was their employees' personal device that they had brought into the office. And you get into some search and seizure issues, as far as if you try and take a device, even if it's your own device, if the employee has it in their knapsack with the cover closed and you can't see what's in there, you get some real issues on whether or not, even though you may believe 100% that your laptop is in that bag, you are going to have some real problems if you try and take that bag or take what's in that bag from them. So just imagine if, even with those issues that you have in your own workplace, what other problems you have in somebody's house, right? So, the ability to monitor it, the ability to enforce anything, and then, what happens when it doesn't work? Are you going to send a tech out to do the install? Is that going to be a new job requirement that you've got to be able to support your own IT infrastructure for all of your work from home employees? What's that going to look like? And you then also, once you start taking some responsibility, you also start taking some of the liability for that as well. So what happens when that network is the source of a breach and you had some responsibility to make sure it was secure? You now have some of the liability for that breach because it wasn't secure. So you want to really draw a very hard line on some of these types of things, and just go back to get HR involved, get your legal team involved, get some experts. Don't just rely on your in-house legal team that helps you with kind of general business stuff. You've got to have somebody that really understands technology law and how that's applied in these different places. And then the other thing is really looking at employment law as well, because in certain states you can do things with employees that you can't do in other states.
Yep.
How do you deal with break time for employees, or how do you deal with leave, right? So do you completely disable somebody's access when they're on leave so that they can't do work, so that they can't claim, well, I was never really on leave because you made me check my email? There's just a ton of these employment issues that come down, and it's a little bit easier when you can say, well, you weren't in the office, so I know you weren't working, or you shouldn't have been working because you don't have your own computer, we don't provide you a computer. Now you've got these employees, maybe they're even hourly employees, that are checking their email at midnight. Now they come back and say, well, hey, you let me check my email at midnight, you didn't say I couldn't do it, and so now you owe me overtime for all of that time that I was doing, working on all of those. So just a ton of issues that you've got to get kind of fleshed out, both from the hardware side, from the employment side. So definitely want to get some legal team involvement in some of these conversations.
Yeah, and look and use some of the cloud provider tools, right? I mean, you have to be very sensitive of data being removed from your controlled environment, and now we've just sort of opened the floodgates. So, people working from home, can they store PII or critical data on their home laptop or home infrastructure that you don't have control or visibility over? Leveraging things like the Google environment or Microsoft O365, and controlling access and manipulation of those documents within that environment, and not allowing it to simply even having a policy in place, right? I mean, we're talking about legal matters. At the end of the day, restrict the ability for people to download stuff into that environment, and if they're going to manipulate it on your end, and just put policies in place that say do not download docs. If you can't prohibit it physically or logically, put a policy in place that says if you do this, we'll terminate you. You're just going to have to take some precautions, but if you can, again, control the data, and that includes working data in an environment that is still maintained by you. So if it's a BYOD environment, have those doc shares, have those critical infrastructure systems, have that data be controlled. And I think we've spoken about that a lot. But there's very clever ways you can do that at very low cost. A lot of the Google and Microsoft Office solutions are very inexpensive for small business. And doing that, can help your business efficiency as well as improve your security posture.
So get your HR team and your attorney involved, sounds like, for sure, as you're making some of these decisions. From a HR training standpoint, And you started to touch on this a little bit there, Terry, about policies around downloading things and things like that. What else, what other kinds of training should be taking place with remote workers? Because we've talked a lot about building the right infrastructure, the right permissions to prevent, build the fence around some of these issues. What are the things we need to be training employees on that they probably don't understand about the new environment they're working in?
Yeah, I think number one, we assume that folks understand the basic controls that we have in an office environment, are things that they would have to replicate at home. And I don't think that's a safe assumption. I don't think it's safe to assume that their environment is locked down, that their systems are up to date, that their home systems are patched, that they've got a good AV solution and their router's locked down and they've got some level of logical separation. I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's a safe assumption for any business leader to assume that that's true. So, and if you can't control that, legally or, physically, then you have to do it through policy and training. And so I think it's articulating that, there's an expectation of when you're handling, business data, what those parameters are and what is accessible, what's not. But then, help them in their home environment, do the same things that you would do in your business environment, provide TTPs, provide training. And I think it's a great opportunity, normally on this annual or maybe even a quarterly training cycle, if you're really advanced, there's nothing keeping you from doing it more frequently and more often. And if you don't have a formal training program, leverage one, know before. There's lots of them out there that can help you do this. But then ensure that, like when in my last organization, we would send out a home newsletter. Like, here's best business practices to give to your family, give it to mom, give it to the kids, here's the things that you should do to be safe at home. And it's nothing more than due diligence, but it's helping. Don't make the assumption that the folks know the control measures that you have at the office that are in place, that they have in their home environment, because I'll guarantee they probably don't. And if you've got teenagers, I know doggone well, security is probably the last thing on anybody's mind at the house, right? So.
Yeah, I think another part of it too is that people have to recognize that they themselves are going to become targets, and their homes can become targets as well. We've talked about the social engineering being a bigger issue. FBI is also saying that physical attacks are on the rise as well. So, and basically what that means is people are breaking into facilities trying to gain access to data, trying to gain access to files and computers and those types of things, and not relying on doing it across the internet. So what does that mean for work from home? Well, it means that if you're an executive, if you're somebody with some key access, if you're somebody that has a lot of potential impact or influence on business decisions and has a lot of company data, you could be at risk as well. You have to look at at the office, we've got a lot of these clean desk policies. Everything's got to be in a locked file cabinet. You've got to lock your workstation when you leave it. Those types of things. And people go around and they check. And so if there's a burglary at 10 p.m. at night, after the office closes, it's going to take them a while to get to what it is that they're looking for, and that is going to hopefully give the police time to get there and apprehend them and take care of the situation. Is that same thing going to happen if you're targeted at home? If you're the CEO, if you're a VP, if you're a senior development manager, and you've got some intellectual property, and it's just at your home office, and there's lots of folders sitting on your desk, and you're like, well, nobody else is around, so it doesn't matter if I leave them here, or if your workstation is sitting there, wide open. Those types of things can become a reality. And so we've got to begin to talk to people and say, hey, cars are being broken into and things are being stolen because people are watching and they see that there's a computer going into the back seat. They may or may not care about what's on the computer. It could be they just hope to take that computer to a pawn shop and make $75 so they can go get their quick score on the corner drug market. But they may also be looking and watching and saying, I know exactly who that person works for, and I wonder what data is on that machine, and I'm going to go find it, and I'm going to go, see if I can sell some of the data that's on there. So we can't downplay the physical risk. I don't want to, make people feel like, oh my gosh, this is a real thing, and I'm going to get burglarized tomorrow. It's certainly not something that's a huge high risk, for everybody, but it is something that we probably need to start thinking about a little bit more and starting to think, if we're going to have a lot more people working from home, do we need to require people to put things in a fireproof safe? Do we need to have, certain things, taken care of at home that we typically would have done, in an office environment.
Yeah, I would avail yourself to some social engineering training as well. There's a couple of companies out there that specialize in training. I think social engineering training specifically, we usually lump it all together in our annual training session. But I would call out specifically. There's a couple of really good companies, and I'm embarrassed because the names escape me. And but they actually have a very, very good training awareness program that make you very sensitive and aware of social engineering techniques, and your team will get more sensitized to it. And I think that's important, especially in this environment where it's even easier to do social engineering attacks against a distributed workforce.
Yeah. The best scams you won't see coming, right? I mean, the thing about the best con men out there are the ones who you trust and believe and have built a relationship with you, and I mean, those are the ones that people get taken for big, huge scores on. So like Terry was saying, train your employees, provide them, the expertise so that they understand that they're under attack and they're being targeted, and be able to identify some of those, things that are coming at them.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the new social engineering threats that are out there? I know when we talked earlier this week, Terry, you talked about deep fakes coming in the voice realm specifically. Mm-hmm. What kinds of things are out there that we need to be keeping on our radar?
Yeah, sadly, some of the things are they play on human nature. I give you a story. I'll erase the names to protect the guilty, but there was a company in the Middle East, and one of their young IT members was blackmailed by an e-crime group because they hacked into his home computer and found child porn on it. Sorry, I got a phone ringing in the background. Hang on one second. All right, we'll just have to talk through it. So the bottom line is the adversary group hacked his home computer. They found child porn on it, and then they blackmailed him to give his credentials to log into the systems that they were trying to hack into. So it was a simple blackmail scheme. They literally took something that he would not want publicly shared, and they blackmailed him into giving it. Of course, it all blew up in his face anyway. He was still prosecuted for both the giving up his credentials and child porn. So that's the human failing part. And as a business leader, there's very little you can do about that type of attack. There's a little bit of a disturbing trend, with artificial intelligence. You've seen deep fake videos on YouTube. You can Google, is this a real person? With the deep fake voice, there's enough of Terry McGraw's voice samples out there where you could string together a deep fake of my voice and it sounds like a normal conversation, or very, very close to a normal conversation, which is why earlier I mentioned the best technique against that is people, process, and technology. If you get a phone call from your boss, if Terry McGraw called one of my subordinates and said, hey, I need you to wire this money for a merger and acquisition discussion we're having, and I need you to do it by close of business today, don't let me down, click. My team should know that the business process is I now send a text or an email to that person validating it was them. And conversely, if I get an email that says the exact same thing, I now pick up the phone and call. It should be a two-party check system. At the end of the day, it's your best defense is business, process, and technology, people, process, and technology. And if you adhere to those two-party check systems, a lot of the social engineering stuff comes apart, but it requires you to be pretty stringent about that.
Yeah, a big part of this too is kind of changing the way that we look at security monitoring, right? We relied a lot on patterns in the past. We relied a lot on traditional SIEM, security information event monitoring, and those things are still great and they're still useful. But as we start having billions of data points a day coming through, as far as who's using what and what are they doing, starting to look more at UEBA, which is short for User Entity Behavior Analytics, really starting to say, what's a pattern that has been normal, and now what's outside of that pattern, right? Okay, yeah, I got an email from Terry, but I've never gotten an email from Terry before, so that in and of itself might be, elevating the risk of that. And then the content of that is that I want a, specific transaction. Well, that increases the risk, right? So now all of a sudden I can assign a risk score to that email and say, hey, this email from Terry is really high risk. Really evaluate it and look at it to make sure that you know that it's from Terry and that you can validate what he's asking you to do. Same thing with, it's not just the users, it's the entities or the devices, right? So a device that's on the network or the device that's connecting to data usually only comes in through, maybe this API, and it only makes these calls and accesses this data. When all of a sudden it comes in through the same API but tries to access other data, or it comes in not even from the API, it kind of tries to make like a direct data connection and start doing things, all of a sudden, all of these things can increase the score of the riskiness of that device or of that user and the behavior, and say, how do I analyze that, and what threat patterns do I have? So you start looking at things like machine learning and artificial intelligence that can start helping predict some of that and providing, a little bit deeper insight into that. And it's really encouraging. Still very much in the infancy. I don't want anybody to get super excited about AI and ML and it's going to change the world here tomorrow. We're still in the infancy of all of this, but there are some really good prospects for how we're going to be able to start seeing some of these changes and some of these behaviors in a whole different light, and not having to rely on humans and our little antenna going up, or the hairs on the back of our neck going, oh, hey, I'm not sure about that. The machine will be able to kind of do that for us and help guide us through that a little bit. So we won't have to rely quite as much on our intuition or our gut. We'll be able to allow our users to get a little bit of a help from the system to say, hey, evaluate this request or evaluate this behavior a little bit before you take action on it.
Good. Well, as we head toward the finish line here, I'm going to ask you both to put on your prognosticator hat a little bit. I'm going to ask you positive and negative. So let's start out negative so we can finish positive. So we think about over the next 3 to 6 months, what would you say is probably your biggest concern as we look at our distributed workforce in the postures that we've been talking about so far today? What concerns you the most in the coming 3 to 6 months?
Distractions. There's just so many distractions right now. People not knowing what they're doing with their kids for school and childcare and what's going to happen next week, not knowing if they're ever going to get back into the office, not knowing if the temporary processes that they're having to struggle with now are going to remain. I think all of those distractions just take us away from kind of focusing on what we need to do to get our jobs done, and probably some of those, again, those things that we normally rely on to help us provide that security in our environments. We're so distracted, we're so rushed, we're so hurried, we're so frazzled with all of the things that some of that security stuff is just the furthest from our mind. And not because we're trying to be lackadaisical, it's just we're in information overload. We've got so many different things hitting us right now that it's just impossible to keep up. So I think that's my biggest concern is how long can we keep up this kind of unknown future, right? And not being able to move forward and people just treading water. I think those distractions are just killing people right now.
Yeah, I second that. I will add an additional point. I agree with you. The economic impact that has been implemented through the COVID and the contraction that we've seen on the economy and the great unemployment is creating its own set of pressures. Small businesses are already under the gun and at risk of collapse. Ransomware attacks and the prevalence thereof will put way more out of business. The average ransom attack last year, the ransom alone was $63,000 was the average. If you then add in remediation, containment costs, and rebuild costs, most small businesses will never recover from that. And so I don't think time's on our side. And as cybersecurity professionals, I think we need to help. I don't think now is the time to not share. I think time now is to come together as community. We always give lip service to it, but we're not, collectively trying to fight this battle. We're fighting in our own foxholes. And at the end of the day, the adversary plays across all of that infrastructure. And so at the end of the day, I really do think we need to do more education. We need to do better blocking and tackling. And the cyber professionals, we don't have a lot of time on our hands. I mean, the small businesses in particular are not going to be able to sustain these whacks. So you get an economic contraction, you get people out of work, and then you get, e-criminals eating the rest of the lunch. It doesn't bode well. And so I'm just begging people to start getting back, basic blocking and tackling. You don't have time on your side anymore. And not that you did, but it's even more so now. So yes, distractions are eating away at all of us, and economic pressures are eating all of us. But we got to close as many windows as we can because too many small businesses are already under the gun.
Well, in 2020, we could all use a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So let's finish by talking about, as you look ahead 3 to 6 months out in this space, what's giving you optimism? What do you think is heading in a good direction? That's obviously a tough question in this year, isn't it?
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think the same thing that's made it difficult is also the same thing that's going to make it better, right? When things are going well, the economy was chugging along, people were making money left and right, unemployment was low, everybody had jobs, and so there was this, hey, let's not screw this up, let's not change what's working, right? Now all of a sudden everything's broken. Right, and then we're trying to. I'm not saying everything is broken. I mean, obviously the economy is still chugging along, but yeah, there are groups and areas of the economy that are really struggling. All of a sudden now, this gives us the opportunity to say, let's change the way we do some things. Right, let's use this as a pivot point. I mean, it takes typically some sort of catastrophic event for businesses to stop and say, what's next? How do we do this? Where do we go from here? And I think a lot of companies weren't willing to do some of that, especially with their security posture. And like Terry was saying, it's going to take changes in our architecture and how we approach, data governance and then these types of things. Nobody's willing to upset the apple cart before. I think this is going to give us the opportunity, and we're seeing this. We're seeing business leaders saying, hey, if I've got to change a gazillion things right now, what else should I be changing? What else, if we're going to go through a huge, massive transformation, let's get it all done. Let's just throw it all on the table and see what sticks, right? So I think the good thing is you're going to see lots of organizations looking at security in a new way, willing to consider things that they were never willing to consider 6 months ago. Moving to this zero trust architecture. Most organizations would never have even had a conversation about that 6 months ago. Now, all of a sudden, it's one of the highest trending Google searches for technology right now, that's out there. So obviously some things are changing for the good.
Yeah, I think the parting thought is we've gone through dark times before, and I've always been impressed, my background is military, but the ability for the human spirit to endure and overcome even the greatest of hardships, I think is a defining characteristic of the human condition. And I think that in this area, we too will overcome. I do, and I agree with you, Dave. I think that, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is going to force us to accelerate and rethink things that we should have done already, that we've known for a long time. Zero trust architectures are not new. Multi-factor authentication is not new. Distributed environments are not new. These things have been around for a long time, but we've not had forcing functions. So let's use those forcing functions to our advantage. But at the end of the day, I do think it's time to, as a community, to do more sharing and collaboration and be a little less risk averse in sharing information across party lines. I do think that it's time for our community and have more of these kind of discussions, have more participation, do more education, in the distributed environment and make it more accessible. But at the end of the day, this too shall pass.
Well, thanks for the good news. We appreciate that and giving us a lot of good things to think about. I appreciate the conversation here today. A lot of tactile things we can do in there in terms of looking at specific policies and things we can adapt in the next few months. Appreciate your input. Obviously, anyone who is watching this with us today or watching a recording in the future, you can always go to Pradam and PCmatic for more information on any of the things that were discussed today and to get in contact with anyone on Dave or Terry's team to find out more about how these organizations can help your company prepare for the environment that we all find ourselves in here in 2020. So Dave, Terry, thank you for your time today. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and joining our conversation, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.